Okay, let's start at the beginning. Simple and ordinary. A December 9th in 1968. Lake Herman Road, Vallejo. 2 teenagers, a Rambler station wagon, and a turnout that people used as a lover's lane. Because that's what the Bay Area felt like then. Open, late nights, the counterculture in full swing, people out and about. And then, violence that made no sense at the time, because nobody yet viewed these kinds of killings as a pattern. That night, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were murdered, and for a while it was just a local, brutal double homicide.
Yeah, Marissa, and to add to that, the Bay Area of 68-69 was practically porous. Students, protests, people hitchhiking. Law enforcement was fragmented, loads of small jurisdictions, Vallejo PD, Benicia, Solano County, Napa, SFPD, and the FBI kind of hovering. There was no real centralized database back then. Reports were paper, interagency coordination depended on phone calls and personalities. It's a dezembit matters because it created the conditions for someone to operate without being easily tracked across county lines.
Right. When you say operated, Evan, do you mean literally the mechanics of movement? How someone could strike in one county and then another, and also how the story could spread but not be pinned down?
Exactly. The killer could move with less risk of profile crossover, and the media environment amplified details but didn't always deliver coordination to investigators. So a crime in Vallejo might be handled very differently from a crime in San Francisco, and sometimes the connecting threads, like oddly specific details about a shooting, weren't shared quickly or cleanly. That mattered when the next attacks happened.
Let's walk through the early attacks in order, because the sequence is important. After Lake Herman Road in December 68, the next major event that stitches into the pattern is Blue Rock Springs on July 4th going into July 5th, 1969. A young woman, Darlene Ferrin, killed, and Michael Majo severely injured but alive. What stands out to me and to investigators was that Majo survived and gave a description that later became crucial and, frankly, problematic. Evan?
Majo's account is a major piece of the puzzle. He described a white male, about 5'8", stocky, large round face, short curly light brown hair, dark clothes, no glasses. That no glasses detail is important because later sketches, particularly from the Presidio Heights murder, include thick-rimmed glasses. So already you have divergent eyewitness detail. Add to that the brutality of Blue Rock Springs, Luger-style 9mm fire, returning to make sure the victims were dead, and then the weird phone call to the Vallejo PD less than an hour later. The caller not only claimed credit, but linked this attack to the Lake Herman Road murders, offering the location and weapon type. That call is when a narrative shift happens. Someone is claiming responsibility and is intentionally shaping the story.
Yes, that 12:40 a.m. call on July 5th is pivotal because it's the first time any perpetrator says plainly, I want to report a double murder. I also killed those kids last year. It ties 2 events together. And then, less than a month later, he escalates his interaction with the press. August 1st, 3 Bay Area newspapers receive near-identical letters, each one with 1/3 of a 408-symbol cipher. That's when the letters become as significant as the crimes themselves.
By August 4th, the letters evolve. One arrives that begins, "This is the Zodiac speaking." That's where the persona is truly born, a media-savvy criminal who wants to shape his legend. He's demanding front-page publication of his cipher and threatening more killings if the papers don't comply. He's using the newspapers as megaphones, which is both audacious and, if you look at it from a forensic or behavioral angle, strategic. He's linking himself to events, giving details that weren't public, and leveraging fear.
There's an odd contradiction at the heart of those ciphers, Evan. The first big one, the Z408, was solved in days by Donald and Betty A. Hardin, and its plaintext is chilling. I like killing because it is so much fun. And the rest. He boasts about the gas chamber not scaring him, about paradise. Yet, despite the Hardin solution, the cipher breaks down at the end. No clear name. He had demanded that his identity be revealed, and he didn't deliver. How do you think that played into the investigation?
It's a critical moment. The Z408 promised an identity, but yielded ideology and taunting instead. The fact that the cipher showed up in 3 pieces across papers suggested either a showy confidence or an attempt to make the solution look harder. When the Hardens solved it and there was no name, it was a double-edged sword. The public got proof of the writer's authenticity and his mindset, but the promised payoff, his name, was absent. That absence became almost as defining as the murders. Zodiac was offering cryptic theater, not concrete confession.
And that pattern repeats. The later Z340, long thought unsolved, had a proposed solution in December 2020 by an international team, and yet even that decoded message does not give a name. And then the Z13, which begins with "My name is," offers only 13 characters and has resisted definitive solution. So chronically, he promises his identity and withholds it. That's maddening to investigators and to families.
Maddening is the right word. The ciphers perform like a magician's misdirection. They dazzle and frustrate simultaneously. Z340's late proposed solution reinforced a pattern. He talks about not fearing the gas chamber, denies being a TV segment subject, repeats his joy in killing, but still no name. Z13 and Z32 remain unresolved in any way that's been widely accepted. Z32, by the way, was associated with a threatened bomb near a school bus route, which never materialized. The letters sometimes read like a blend of bravado and bluff.
Let's step back to the other confirmed attacks, because they complicate the profile. Lake Berryessa in September 1969 has a near-Gothic quality. A man in a black hood and costume, with the crossed circle symbol on his chest, approaches Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, ties them up, stabs them with a large knife, then writes on Brian's car the dates and locations of previous attacks. He even calls the sheriff from a payphone afterwards. That scene feels ritualistic, almost theatrical, compared to the quick surgical shootings at Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs. How do investigators reconcile method changes like that?
They struggle with it, and for good reason. The methods vary. Drive-up shootings, a stabbing with costume and writing, an urban cab murder in Presidio Heights. And yet there are tying elements. The crossed circle symbol reappears, the phone calls claiming credit, and some consistent voice qualities on those calls. But behaviorally, it's a mismatch. Some profilers argue a single offender can evolve or experiment. Others insist the differences suggest multiple actors or copycats. Then add the eyewitness inconsistencies. Majot saw no glasses. Presidio Heights witnesses and composites emphasize glasses. Hartnell saw almost nothing of the face because of the hood. So the behavioral and descriptive data push and pull in different directions.
Which brings us to the central tension I want to pull at today. The description that doesn't fit. Across the cases you just mentioned, Blue Rock Springs, Lake Berryessa, Presidio Heights, we get a rough composite. White male, stocky, 5'8" to 5'10", late 20s to 40s, sometimes glasses. But when you look closely, inconsistencies accumulate, like we said. Voice, clothing, method changes, even handwriting and letter style variations. How reliable are those discrepancies? Are they normal variability, or do they point to something deeper?
Eyewitness reliability is shaky in traumatic events. People reconstruct memory. Teenagers who saw him at the cab scene, the stress of a stabbing at Lake Berryessa with a hooded assailant, these are not ideal conditions for perfect description. That said, the differences are more than small wiggles. They're substantive. Then you have questions about the letters themselves. Some shared blocky printing across many letters, but subtle handwriting variations that caused some experts to wonder whether every letter came from the same person. Combine that with misspellings that may be deliberate and tone shifts across correspondence, and you have a patchwork. Some parts likely from the killer, some possibly from imitators, and maybe some genuine evolution over time.
Pause for a second. Some listeners might be thinking, Isn't the Presidio Heights murder the one that provided the most physical proof? The killer mailed a piece of Paul Stein's bloodied shirt to the Chronicle, right? That seems like a slam dunk for identification. Evan?
Yes, the inclusion of Paul Stein's shirt piece in a later letter is one of the clearest instances linking letter authorship to a specific murder. It proves at least that the person writing that letter had access to that piece of evidence, which strongly suggests authorship by the killer or someone very close to the crime scene. But here's the catch. Fingerprints recovered from that cab and from letters have never produced a match robust enough to bring charges. DNA from envelopes and stamps has been examined over the years. Some touch DNA was reported, but contamination across decades of handling undermines confident attribution. So the shirt piece ties letter to crime, but it doesn't name a living suspect conclusively.
Which loops us back to the bigger one-clue problem. For all the eyewitness sketches, letters, ciphers, and the piece of shirt, nothing locks down a single identity conclusively. Every promising suspect fits almost, but never all the way. Arthur Lee Allen is the most famous example. Gary Post was proposed recently by a private group, but law enforcement hasn't signed off. Why is that so hard to close?
There are practical reasons and procedural ones. With Allen, there were suspicious elements: ownership of similar weapons, comments he allegedly made, a Zodiac watch bearing a crosshair symbol, and yet handwriting experts said his writing didn't match the Zodiac letters, and fingerprint DNA comparisons were inconclusive. Prosecutors need proof that holds in court. Without a smoking gun, weapon with the suspect's DNA, a clear, admissible DNA match from letters, or unequivocal fingerprint matches, they're unlikely to bring charges that could be defeated. The Poste claim from private investigators in 2021 ran into the same problem. The evidence offered was mostly circumstantial pattern matching and not endorsed by official agencies.
So at root, the case is built on almosts. He almost gives his name in the ciphers, but doesn't. Witness descriptions almost converge, but leave room for doubt. Suspects almost fit, but fail forensic checks. That's the case's emotional cruelty, a famous unsolved mystery that nonetheless refuses to yield the definitive clue. Evan, do you think modern techniques, advanced DNA or new cryptanalysis, could change that calculus?
Potentially. DNA technology has advanced dramatically. What used to be too degraded can sometimes be rebuilt into partial profiles. But for the Zodiac letters, contamination is a real killer, no pun intended, because they were handled by reporters, police, and the public for decades. Even if you get a profile, if it's partial or mixed, it may not be enough. As for ciphers, computer-assisted analysis cracked Z340 in 2020, but puzzles like Z13 are too short to yield a unique solution reliably. So yes, technologies help, but they don't guarantee an airtight match when the physical or textual evidence is incomplete, mishandled, or intentionally misleading.
Let's talk about the theories people use to make sense of all this. I see three major ones in the source material. 1, a lone killer who stopped or died. 2, a man who exaggerated his crimes for attention. And 3, that investigators had a likely suspect, but never had enough evidence to prosecute. Which of these do you find most plausible, Evan?
All three have merit and limitations. Theory 1, he was a lone killer who stopped, fits the continuity of certain elements: the symbol, the phone calls, some letter consistencies, and the fact that killers sometimes have cooling-off periods or stop due to incarceration or death. But it's challenged by method variability. Theory 2, that he exaggerated, explains the claimed body count of 37 versus the smaller number of confirmations. It accounts for bogus bomb threats and inflated claims. Theory 3, that the right person was suspected but evidence insufficient, also rings true historically. Investigators often have favorites but lack legal proof. Honestly, the truth could be a blend: a single killer who committed the core crimes and then tacked on false claims, while copycats and hoaxers added noise.
I want to linger on that inflated body count. Zodiac claimed up to 37 murders, but the cases widely accepted as his are the 4 attacks we've mentioned, 5 dead and 2 survivors. There are other possible links: Sherry Jo Bates in Riverside in 1966, the Domingos and Edwards case in 1963, but no universal forensic acceptance. Why do you think he, or someone using the Zodiac name, would claim so many more victims?
The most straightforward explanation is one of power through myth. Claiming more victims inflates terror and cements a public image. It's the behavior of someone enjoying notoriety. Also, some claims might be opportunistic. He reads reports of unsolved murders and claims them to amplify fear. From an investigative standpoint, it muddies the waters, pulling resources and attention into false leads. The overall pattern suggests a persona that values reputation as much as actual body count.
There's also the human cost to consider. Think about the families. They live with an internationally famous case, and yet no one has been held accountable in court. That's brutal. Evan, how has this long, almost but not quite resolution affected investigators like Dave Toshi and the public perception?
It's a long, career-devouring obsession for many. Toshi and others spent years, decades, building files and pursuing suspects. That level of focus can give careers shape, but can also be corrosive. You can end up with confirmation biases, tunnel vision, and massive file drawers of near matches. Publicly, the case becomes a mythology. Films and books feed the legend, and that legend can obscure the original victim's stories. The more the myth grows, the harder it is to separate solid leads from sensationalism.
Speaking of myth, the costume at Lake Berryessa, black hood, crosshair symbol, was theatrical in a way that seems designed for story. He writes on the car door the dates of prior attacks, uses the symbol. Those are performative acts. Is it possible that the theatrical elements were meant more for the public narrative than for tactical needs?
Absolutely. The Berryessa scene reads like an attempt to stage his own mythology. Putting the symbol on the chest and writing dates on the car are communicative acts, messages to the investigators and the public, not necessities for escaping. He's turning crime into performance and letters into stage direction. That's the kind of thing that posthumously helps him become a legend, and that's exactly what he seemed to want.
Let's break the narrative into segments for listeners who may be taking notes. Cold open in December 68, pattern emerges July 69 with Blue Rock Springs and the phone call, August 69 letters and Z408, September 69 Lake Berryessa, October 69 Presidio Heights, then the ciphers and the long unsolved aftermath. That chronological backbone helps, but I want to make sure we emphasize the one clue that still doesn't make sense, that nothing fits perfectly. What are the most concrete examples you'd point to as pieces that almost fit but fail?
Concrete examples. 1. Michael Majau's description at Blue Rock Springs, no glasses, contrasting with the Presidio Heights composite that emphasizes glasses. 2. Handwriting. Many letters show a blocky, similar print, but forensic analysts documented subtle variations across letters that raised doubts about single authorship. 3. The ciphers. Z408 promises a name, but doesn't deliver. Z340's proposed solution still lacks unique personal identifiers. Z13 and Z32 remain unresolved. 4. Suspects like Arthur Lee Allen, who have suspicious circumstantial evidence but fail forensic tests. Each element checks some boxes and fails others.
Short one. That's infuriating. Evan, do you ever think we're missing a fundamental piece? Some misinterpreted clue, a misstated letter, that if seen correctly would make the rest click?
I do. Investigations sometimes hinge on a single misread detail, a misattributed phone call, a mistaken timeline, or contaminated evidence that shouldn't have been trusted. It's possible something like that exists in this case, a small pivot point that, if reinterpreted, could consolidate evidence around a suspect. But despite decades of archival projects and reanalysis, nothing has surfaced with wide consensus.
Let me interrupt. Sorry. Because listeners will ask, what about the 2020 Z340 solution?
Didn't that change things?
It was a technical breakthrough and an important moment, yes. An international team proposed a readable plaintext for Z340 in December 2020 using computer-assisted methods. The content matched thematic elements found elsewhere in Zodiac correspondence, bravado about not fearing the gas chamber, for instance. But crucially, it still didn't provide a name or a conclusive identifier. So it expands our understanding of his rhetoric and persona, but doesn't collapse the suspect field.
Okay, let's walk through the three theories again briefly and give listeners a sense of the strengths and weaknesses in one breath each. Theory 1, lone killer who stopped or died. Strength, continuity of symbol and letters. Weakness, variability of method. Short, Evan.
Strength, single mind can explain consistent symbolism, phone calls, letters. Weakness, method changes and eyewitness discrepancies create real doubt.
Theory 2. He exaggerated strength, explains inflated body count and bomb threats. Weakness doesn't explain the 4 core attacks and the shirt piece link. Evan?
Right. It accounts for grandiose claims and some factual errors in letters, but it can't fully explain why the same persona shows up with a tangible link to a confirmed murder like Stein's.
Theory 3. Investigators had a likely suspect, but never enough evidence enough. Strength, detectives often do develop favorites. Weakness, legal standards require proof, and sometimes the best available suspect still fails forensic tests. Evan?
Precisely. You can be convinced in your gut, but without admissible proof, handwriting, fingerprints, DNA, you won't get a conviction or an official public declaration that settles the case.
Let's get a bit human. The family's names, again. David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Darlene Farron, Michael McGaugh survived. Brian Hartnell survived. Cecilia Shepard died. Paul Stein died. Those names must never be lost in the mythology. How do we keep victims central when the case becomes cultural lore?
It takes deliberate effort. Every time we tell the story, we should intersect it with those names and their families' experiences. We should remember that the letters and ciphers were not puzzles for enjoyment, but taunts at families' pain. Media representations can emphasize the victims' lives instead of just the killer's mystique. Investigators and podcasters alike can call attention to the human toll of unresolved cases.
Exactly. One more practical question. If a listener today has an idea or an old piece of memorabilia they think is relevant, what should they do? Evan?
Contact the official agencies, Vallejo PD, SFPD, or the FBI, rather than broadcasting online. Evidence handling needs to be careful. Contamination is a major problem. Law enforcement can advise on how to preserve items and whether they're worth submitting. Amateur sleuthing that contaminates or mischaracterizes evidence can actually make official work harder.
Good advice. Now, let's talk about the meta clue. Maybe the real one clue is that the case is fundamentally built on almosts. That seems less like a single missing item and more like a structural problem. The ciphers, the letters, the eyewitnesses, and the suspects all provide partial fits. It's a diagnostic of ambiguity more than a single clue. Evan, any final thoughts on why some cases become still unanswered in that structural way?
They become unanswered when they're porous to myth and contamination, when evidence is messy, and when the public appetite for certainty outpaces what the facts can provide. The Zodiac case is a textbook in how notoriety and media interaction complicate investigations. The killer courted publicity and then hid behind it. Over decades, the evidence degraded or was mishandled. Copycats and hoaxes multiplied, and that made firm closure harder to achieve. In short, cultural fame became forensic friction.
Short, sharp. Cultural fame became forensic friction. Before we close, Evan, quick lightning round. One sentence on what you wish investigators had done differently in 6970. One sentence on what we should hope for now.
and one sentence for the families. Ready?
I wish they'd centralized the investigated files across agencies from the start and limited uncontrolled handling of physical evidence early on. Now we should hope for careful, scientifically rigorous re-examination of any preserved evidence with modern methods, and for public transparency about what those tests can and cannot do. And to the families, your loss deserves more than speculation. It deserves respect, clarity when possible, and acknowledgement when certainty is unattainable.
Thank you, Evan. That's powerful. As we wrap, I want to return to a line from the Z408 decrypted text. His declaration that killing gives him a quick pathway to something he calls paradise, misspelled, taunting. It's chilling, not only for what it says about the person's mind, but for what it reveals about the case's enduring problem. He wanted to be seen. He wanted a legend. And he left us with half answers. The one clue that doesn't make sense is that all roads lead to an almost name, an almost match, an almost evidence trail.
And that is the tragedy. We have the persona fully on display, but the man behind it remains obscured. The case forces us to accept uncertainty in a way most criminal investigations don't. That's uncomfortable because we want closure, but it's also a reminder that the criminal justice system depends on concrete, admissible proof and not just on narrative satisfaction.
Short final thought. If you're listening and you're drawn to this case, please remember the victims' names as you indulge your curiosity. And keep your skepticism. The Zodiac story is a study in how myth proliferates when facts are incomplete. Evan, thank you for joining me. Your knowledge of primary documents and careful evidence-first voice added a lot today.
Thank you, Marissa. It's been an important conversation. And to listeners, if you want to read more, start with the original police reports and the archived letters. Look for primary sources rather than sensational summaries.
One last pause. We'll link to the primary documents and recommended reading in the show notes, including the Z408 solution, the Z340 analysis, and timelines for the confirmed attacks. Thank you all for listening to this episode of Still Unanswered. I'm Marissa Cole. Evan?
Thanks for joining us. Stay curious, stay careful, and remember, sometimes the most important clue is the one that refuses to fit.
Goodbye for now.